It's amazing how easy it is to increase profits by being good at pricing.
And I say pricing is the smartest and the fastest way to increase revenue and margin. Pricing needs to work closely from the start of the year almost, when you're creating budgets and forecasts, all the way down to your revenues and margin. And no one is more well versed with how and where revenue comes from as your pricing people.
Inflation is that there will be a future margin squeeze associated with it if you're not able to increase prices and keep them in line with what's going on.
When you don't question it, a lot of bad promotions and bad rebates go through. All sorts of rebates, on-invoice rebates, off-invoice rebates, volume rebates, kickbacks. So if you're not controlling that entire spectrum of rebates, you are losing out to someone who is. Before we optimize price, we optimize discounts.
What's the number one technical skill pricing professional?
Modeling, statistics, and probability, I would say.
For FP&A, it's going to be...
FP&A guy here. I want to let you in on a little secret. I don't know I always have a sponsor for FP&A Tomorrow, but I always have costs. I work hard to produce the best FP&A show out there. And sometimes I need your help to help support the show. Today, I'm sharing my new digital courses I've launched, FP&A Business Partnering and Modern Excel. These courses can help transform the way you work as an FP&A professional. Well, I hope you'll consider signing up for these courses. Paying for these courses using my services helps me continue to provide you world-class content. Thanks for considering signing up for my courses, and use podcast to save 20% on any of my courses. Welcome to our first LinkedIn Live for FP&A Tomorrow. I've done several of these for FP&A today, but this is the first one for FP&A Tomorrow, as we're a new podcast, and I'm thrilled to have with me two amazing guests. And we're going to talk about a subject that I think is underutilized across the business, often misunderstood, and something that finance and FP&A can make a bigger difference in than they do today. And so our subject is how pricing and how FP&A can influence pricing, how we work together, how we should be a part of that. And I have two pricing experts here with me. I have Nate and I have Karan here with me, and I'm super excited for you to get to hear from them because they know a lot more about pricing than I do. I've dealt with it for sure, and really excited to jump into the subject. So please let us know where you're coming from as we jump into things. Tell us where you're located, any questions you may have or things you'd like to learn from today. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Tina, thanks for joining us from South Africa. Welcome. All righty. So where we're going to kick this session off is we're going to start by asking our guests to just tell us a little bit about themselves and their background, how they ended up where they're at today. So Nate, why don't we start with you?
Yeah. Hey, I'm Nate Kaemingk. I am calling from Atlanta, Georgia. So I actually started out as a mechanical engineer. And as an engineer, I learned a whole bunch of inferential statistics, which is like super nerdy. Somebody in marketing got a hold of that, said, that sounds terrible. Let's call it AI instead. And that's probably better. So I started as a mechanical engineer. And then when I did my MBA, a bunch of the commercial bankers said, hey, we've never seen anybody do this before. This is pretty cool. And so I figured out, hey, I've got a shot. So I ended up working for Cummins Diesel, who's a Fortune 500 company. And I got to do what's called product planning. And that was at the intersection of forecasting, engineering, and pricing. And so I got to do pricing with a lot of zeros behind what I was doing. And so it was just a wonderful experience, and it was very useful. And I've been able to apply it to a lot of businesses around the U.S. since then. So that's me.
Well, thank you, Nate. Let's go ahead and turn it over to Karan. If you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Paul, for having me. My name is Karan Sood. I am joining from Toronto, Canada. I stumbled into pricing, and I say stumbled because almost everyone in pricing stumbles into pricing because no one goes to price. People say, fine, I want to go in finance. I want to go in marketing. I want to go in strategy, sales. No one says I want to go in pricing because it's such a small niche within marketing. When we were in schools, they said, hey, here's the 4 pages on pricing. And that's pretty much it. So I stumbled into pricing. I started my career at GM in the automotive industry, did parts pricing there. So almost every GM car at one point had some version of my hands on it. And then I worked in print and digital advertising for a number of years. Almost $1 billion organization. And then I worked in CPG and retail, selling protein powder and health supplements. And then I switched on to electronics hardware. So I've worked across several different industries. And what's unique is that in almost every organization, I sat in almost a different team. So I've sat in sales, I've sat in marketing, I've sat inside supply chain, in finance. So I have a bit of a perspective on almost how everyone views pricing, and hopefully we can bring it all up today with Paul and Nate. So
thank you so much for sharing, and I agree with you. Right, there's no specialization for pricing in school. Nobody goes to college and thinks, I'm going to go get a pricing specialization. It's like nobody goes and gets an FP&A specialization. You say, I want to do finance. And then you realize, oh, FP&A is part of finance. That sounds interesting. I'll try that. Or you get out in the real world and somebody's like, we got to figure out pricing. You understand numbers. You understand a little bit of marketing or whatever they want. Why don't you be our pricing person? And I'm going to guess it probably started something like that. You were given a project about pricing, and before you know it, you became the pricing person. So I think it's very common. Obviously, some organizations have dedicated pricing. We had a pricing team when I was at American Express, but often it's more of, we need to figure that out type of thing in a lot of companies, especially smaller. So I want to start with something I found really fascinating, and I think both of you have heard this. So we'll start with you, Karan, on this question. I read a study, it was made available on LinkedIn, where it said SaaS companies were spending more time on average during a year focusing on janitorial services than pricing. So why don't we start with that? What's your thoughts on that? I know you read the study, and then we'll go to you, Nate.
Yeah, I read the study, and I think it came out of the house of Patrick Campbell and Price Intelligently a number of years ago. And when I saw that, I had two questions. I mean, one question and one comment, I think, that I still think about. One is like, who is spending that much amount of time on janitorial services? That's a lot of time for janitorial services. Pricing, I'm not surprised. Because I've been through that entire journey, so I know how much time companies spend. I've been in companies where we spend barely any time at all, at a company that were very robust. And the second comment, I think Paul, you just mentioned it a couple of moments ago, was this notion of what is a pricing analyst? And a lot of companies, what they do is they misclassify pricing people into like business analysts, or they'll make them a sales analyst, or they'll make them a financial analyst and have them sit under finance. Sales analyst sits under sales, and business analyst maybe, could be anywhere. And what then happens is that, and this is what happens is none of those people end up being well versed in the area of pricing. They become great financial analysts, make great models. They become great sales guys to help sales guys sell more, and business analysts to put together good business cases. But the art of pricing goes beyond just number crunching. That goes into like cross-functional alignment on what the goals are. And with FP&A, for example, being a key stakeholder there. So I think it's the misclassification, and that misclassification leading to people not going into the pricing career in a way, and they end up going into financial careers and marketing careers and sales careers, and not so much as pricing. And what happens, like finance is a key example. Like FP&A and pricing needs to work closely from the start of the year, almost, when you're creating budgets and forecasts, all the way down to your revenues and margin. And no one is more well versed with how and where revenue comes from as your pricing people. So I think it's where the cross collaboration really shines, and why pricing people we need more cross collaborators in pricing than just spreadsheet junkies, which anyone can be for the most part.
Nate, what's your thoughts on the study? I mean, do you think we spend more time on making sure we have toilet paper than we do pricing?
I mean, you got to have toilet paper, or some form of wipe. If I can do a shout out to Atlanta-based Good Wipes here, but it's interesting to me because I feel like one of the things I see happen a lot is it's because there's not a pricing person whose job it is to get all of the perspectives, you end up having finance and ops that arguing with sales. And it's more about who's better in an arm wrestle than it is about like, okay, well, what do we need to do to increase pricing? I do want to offer a little tidbit, and it's that it's amazing how easy it is to increase profits by being good at pricing. So I've spoken to CEOs and companies all around the country, and I've been adding up how much, hey, this is how much extra profit we identified. And the number's over $100 million in the last 9 months, just from presenting a bunch of ideas and ways to increase pricing. So it's incredibly easy to do that. But like we've been talking about, because there's not a specialization, it takes somebody who is, you have to fall into it, like Karan and I did, and then then you also have to do the math that says, oh, wow, like this investment is really going to pay off. So we should actually spend some time on this, but it's not obvious, right? It's not obvious to the normal business person. Honestly, what I see happen more often than anything else is people just do cost plus pricing. They say, oh, well, I want, 20% margin. So I'm going to get really good at adding up my costs and I'm going to add 20%. Well, the truth is nobody cares how much it costs you. All they care about is this good enough? Am I going to get a return on investment for this thing that I'm buying? And so it's cost plus pricing is good enough to make a profitable company. And maybe it's not obvious that what you thought, 20% might be what you're used to doing, but if you do 2 or 3 things, you can add 3% to your top line, which immediately falls all the way to the bottom. I'll say one more thing. I saw a study that says this, and I did the math and proved it. The average company will get an 11% increase in net margin, net profit, actual dollars in the bank from a 1% increase in price. Now, for the spreadsheet nerds out here, how that works out is if you have 9% net profit as your percentage point, then a 1% increase in price on the top is going to end up, the math works out, right? But it's shocking when people hear that, right? That's a surprising statistic. So I'll stop for right there.
No, thank you. I appreciate you sharing that. And as I hear both of you talk and we talk about pricing, I definitely can relate to the conversations of, hey, cost plus. I mean, I've been in meetings where company, okay, finance, what does the price need to be? Like, well, here's the margin we need to earn. What is the right price for the market? You guys tell me product, marketing, sales. It's not my job to finalize this price. I have to ensure we don't lose our shirt.
Yes.
And then I'll share my opinions on it. But, as long as you meet the requirements of the company from a financial perspective, that's something you need to weigh in on because you understand the market, the customer, the sales a lot better than I do. And those led to good discussions when I framed it that way. But I had a few times like, will you tell me the price? No, let's open it up to more of a discussion. And kind of speaking to that discussion, before we jump into that part of it, I know we'll get there in a minute. A couple other questions I want to go through. And, before I do that, just want to welcome all those who are telling where they come from. A couple other people, so you're aware. We have someone from Ottawa, Canada. We have London, Tennessee, Sri Lanka. So thank you, everyone who's joining us. Karan, I want to ask you a question. You've spent your entire career in pricing. As you mentioned, it's not something anyone comes out of school saying, hey, I'm going to go into pricing. So tell a little more of that backstory and why you've stayed in pricing. What is it you love about pricing?
Yeah, so I think Nate mentioned it a little bit in green, which is fastest way. And I say pricing is the smartest and the fastest way to increase revenue and margin. And it's so under focused in almost every company. And you see it coming through the pandemic and after the pandemic where companies, they're cutting jobs and cutting headcount, etc. But you see on the other spectrum, there are companies who are raising prices. And at the same time, you don't hear any job losses coming out from those companies because at the same time, it's a lucrative and a fast way to get to higher margin and revenue. And to what the Nate study that he pointed out, the 1% increase in price leads to 11% increase in profit margins coming out of McKinsey years ago. It still holds true. And I do the math every single day where people say, hey, let me cut prices by 20%. And my immediate answer is at 60% margin, for example, you would have to sell 50% more. Are you willing to do that? So there's simple math. So and when you flip it the other way and say, hey, let's increase price by 3%, and your sales would have to drop by 20% before it actually makes, before I start losing money. So it's very lucrative from making margin. And think about cable companies and telecom companies. They were making money in their sleep, increasing prices year after year after year. How did you think cable got to a point where it made no sense for them to be at that price compared to Netflix? Because over the years they kept on raising prices and they relied on consumers not caring enough about a 3% inflationary or 4% or 5% price increase. That over time, that's where most of their margin was coming from. So it's where a good chunk of a profit margin can come from, as long as you know and you're smart about when to increase price, how to increase price, how to communicate that price increase in the market, because you can fall flat. You have seen cases this year of people rolling back their price increase because customers complain, but that's where the magic happens, where you make sure you have the cross-functional know-how and alignment on when, how, and how much of a price increase you can put through, and being smart about it. So that's where I think the magic happens.
But thank you for sharing that. And I really like what you said of being strategic and smart about it. I worked at a company where, every new product, every contract we did, we always had to put a value prop to help justify what was the value we were giving the customer versus what we were charging. And it was a little extreme in that they always wanted a range around it. It had to be 4-to-1 to 8-to-1. Otherwise, you had to justify why. But it was really good exercise when it was done right to really force you to think about, okay, what's the actual value the end customer is getting? And am I pricing appropriately? Are they getting more value than makes sense for what I'm doing, or less value in some cases, which the CEO would always be like, all right, well, then you need to add more to the product, software type based products. And so it was that was an eye opener for me, as it just kind of a whole different way to think about price and how much of a focus it was at that company. So I really appreciate you sharing that. Nate, I have one more question for you, and then we're going to jump into a number of pricing questions I have. But I think you alluded at it earlier when you went to MBA school. They saw some things you hadn't done. But how did you go kind of from engineering to MBA to now being kind of an expert around forecasting and inflation and pricing? Maybe tell a little bit more of kind of that story and what's interested you in what you're doing today.
Yeah, definitely. Good question. It's interesting because I got to do a whole bunch of forecasting for my own business. And then when I was at Cummins, but I didn't, and I really enjoyed it because my brain is naturally wired to be a futurist. So, but what ended up happening is after I left Cummins, my wife and I took a little bit of a sabbatical, and, we actually bought an RV and drove around the country.
This is your RV journey. I've heard about this.
Yeah. But we're not going to talk about that because that would take about an hour or 12. But when I was on the road, I started freelancing and found out that there's forecasting is an area that's really difficult. I joke about it now. It's like, man, forecasting sucks, but that's my job. It can be fun for the right person. So I ended up freelancing, and then that is what turned into the company I have today. Now, the reason that I have refreshed and gone back to all the different pricing, I think I looked up the number of different pricing methodologies that I've worked with different companies on, and it's 15, 16 different ways of increasing prices. In forecasting, I have a lot of companies that are, when inflation started happening, it was like, well, what's that going to do to my business? And the number one thing that inflation has done to businesses is it's turned into a margin squeeze. So your costs are increasing, right? So since inflation started, if I just pick a point in time of, say, December of 2020, right? That's kind of when things started going up. We've had over a 20% increase in consumer price index overall. And in some specific areas, it's more like 40% increase in overall price. So the money you're getting today is worth 20 to 40% less than the money that you were getting at that time. And so the net result of inflation is that there will be a future margin squeeze associated with it if you're not able to increase prices and keep them in line with what's going on. And inflation's it's still at 3.4%, which sounds okay, but that's actually still not great. And we're looking at more than a year, maybe 2 years, best case, before we get back to the 2% year over year. That's the target for the Federal Reserve. And there's a whole lot of stuff that has to happen. I'm not going to get too far into that today. But what that tells us is that over the next 2 years at minimum, and potentially the next 6 to 7 years, depending on, are we going to have another wave of inflation? Could that happen? That pricing is going to become one of the most important things that we get good at over the next half decade. Because for 40 years, we didn't have inflation. We didn't have that much of an issue. And now all of a sudden it's become an issue again. And so we can't just do our normal, add a 3% price riser into your contracts and it'll increase by 3% year over year. We have to get better at increasing prices. Now, during the pandemic, you could just say like, oh, well, hey, we're the only ones that have this stuff, so you just got to pay the price. But when supply catches up, you don't have that luxury anymore of saying, yeah, I just have to pass my costs on to you, because it's starting to become more competitive again. And so if we get better at the value side of what we're offering, like, hey, I'm offering, yes, my stuff is whatever price, but I can get you a 10-to-1 return on investment. If you'll, for every dollar you invest in this technology or this capability, you're going to get at least $10 in profit in the future. Tell me if I actually answered all your questions, Paul, but I'll stop.
FP&A guy here. Today, I want to talk about the tool FP&A professionals use more than any of, Microsoft Excel. If you're not learning modern Excel, you're missing out. Modern Excel includes dynamic arrays, Power Query, and so much more. That is why I'm excited to share my new Microsoft Excel course. In this course, talk about Excel tables and how they're the gateway to modern Excel. You need them for Power Query. You need them for Copilot. Talk to you about Copilot. And I also talk about dynamic arrays. There is 50 plus videos in this course. Register today. Go to the FP&A guy, click on my courses, Microsoft Excel, and it will take you to the course. Use the code podcast to save 20%. Sign up today. Sounds good. Thank you. I appreciate that one, Nate. I want to get your thoughts, Karan. What would you say about kind of inflation and what we've seen the last few years in pricing, kind of just addressing what Nate mentioned there a little bit?
I think Nate had it right. Like, a lot happened in the last 3 or 4 years, and stuff was flying off the wall. Like, even if it was a digital product or a physical product, it didn't matter. Companies couldn't just build fast enough, and the supply chain wasn't catching fast enough. But now, as much as the inflation is at that 3% level, which is still high, some industries are getting caught up faster than the others. So, and for companies that are coming out of the pandemic, there's two ways to go around this. You have companies like P&G, for example, that raised prices during the pandemic to the tilt, like 6%, 7%, quarter after quarter, year after year, they increase prices. Now they're at a point where they're like, okay, the prices are high, but can they sustain it? And companies that are innovating and which are very good at innovation will be able to stick with that price point perhaps for a little bit longer and maybe ride it through the entire wave. And those companies will be catching it in at some point. And P&G does that all the time. They do that all the time, where they increase prices, add more value to the product, make sure it penetrates the market well, and then they cash in. And on the flip side, there are companies, and you just saw Target. Target came out with this whole inflation fatigue strategy right now, where they have taken massive price drops from 4% to 16% across the board. And now that's a major price drop. A 4% price drop or 10% price drop on something that's like a 30% margin item would mean the sales would have to jump up quite significantly. Now, can Target do it? Maybe, maybe not. That time will tell. And on the flip side, companies have made that reducing prices a strategy. Like IKEA made this huge investment and said, hey, we are going back to where we were 3 years ago almost, because our costs have come down. So we want to pass it on to you. So they made this a strategy. They didn't say we're cutting prices because whatever. Like, they said, hey, here's a commitment to lower prices. Here's a $600 million commitment to lower prices by actually doing all these things and, rationalizing our pricing and reducing prices to pre-pandemic level. And they're banking on the footfall. So I think there's two ways. You can hide with the price changes or, the price reductions, or you can be more open about it and make a strategy out of it. And I think if you are able to make a strategy out of it, then you might be in a better shape than just passing a price increase and just price decrease and just letting it rip in the market, because no one will notice. Some people may not notice Target decrease the price by 10% and that's just lost margin at that point. Yeah. So I think, that's where I think
I appreciate that. And I love you got into the strategic side of things. And I want to get a little more into that. But before we do, I have a practical question I want to ask. But before I ask this, I'm just going to let the audience know if you have any questions, put them in the comments. We'll take them throughout the podcast here. We'll be happy to address as many questions as we can. So please go ahead and add your questions as we're discussing this, or let us know your thoughts. We'd love to make this interactive. So what I want to ask before we jump into a little more strategy is, in your guys' view, what's the role FP&A and finance should play in pricing? Like, how should they be involved? Why is it so important that they play a role? Because I think often FP&A doesn't play a role, or finance doesn't play a role outside of maybe just looking at it and be like, all right, margins are good and moving on. So why don't we start with you, Karan? What's your thoughts there? And then we'll go to you, Nate, on that.
Yeah. So, I mean, FP&A holds the keys to strategic financial decision-making in the company. So there's no escaping from that. And pricing holds the keys for how those targets translate into sales goals and pricing goals and product goals in a way. So I think for them to work together, my biggest issue throughout my career with FP&A has been sometimes the lack of communication on what exactly is the strategy. Where exactly are we? Because remember, pricing requires a very clear North Star in almost every organization. You either are pricing your product to increase revenue, you're pricing your product to increase margin, or you're pricing your product to increase adoption and just sales in the market, units in the market, digital or non-digital. And both on all those strategies require different pricing strategies. And if FP&A and pricing are not aligned on January 1st or December or October the year before about next year, then it's just going to be, what they say, the dog's breakfast in the end, because they won't be aligned. Finance is going to have one view of how financial and revenue metrics are, what financial revenue metrics are, and pricing is going to have another. So I think the clear communication key is where I think they really need to work and cross collaborate. And the second one is transparency, I think. And I think that's on both sides. Finance is always, the finance people are always finance sense. They know what they're doing. They feel they know what they're doing. They know what the numbers are. They know what price. Everyone in finance will have an opinion on price. That's a given, regardless of where in finance you are. And the transparency between the work or where we are or what FP&A has for a budget or a forecast or whatever for a year, and having it open to pricing people and pricing people opening up their models and how they price open to FP&A is where I think a lot of work needs to be done. Right now, they both work in a very siloed world of like, here's my models and my work of it. Why don't you submit your work? And the other side is pricing people are also saying the same thing. Why don't you tell me what you want and what you have? So I think there's a little bit of collaboration and getting to the same sort of level and is what's required between FP&A and pricing, because they're both very strong. They both are in a strong pricing team and a strong FP&A team, you can possibly do each other's job in a way. Like, you can be a very prudent pricing analyst in finance if you master a few concepts, and same goes for pricing. I feel pricing people need to know more FP&A. They need to know more accounting. They need to know more about accruals and NPV, etc. So I think it's a little bit of a transparency and opening up to each other that's required.
I like how you said there's definitely some transparency and opening up to each other and making it more collaborative that's required. I think sometimes, like you said, we're in our own silos. Nate, your thoughts on that question?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I want to acknowledge the one foundational piece that you said first before I'll move into what I would say is more of an advanced approach. And I think it's actually incredibly important for the FP&A team to be the ones that say, are we going to make money, or are we going to lose money at that price point? Right. So that's like, hey, 101 basic level, you've got to be there and be a part of that conversation, because if it's just, we're making margin, but you're not covering your variable costs and your overheads, and you're actually, a good example that I've seen happen is it's surprising now that the cost of capital is higher. It's surprising how often just having working capital laying out there, how much that actually costs. And that's not something we've had to think about for probably 15 years now, right? All of a sudden working capital is expensive.
Money's not free anymore, basically.
Money's not free anymore, yes, which is, I'm not going to go down that road, but that's actually probably a good thing overall long term. But anyways, I want to focus on one other piece of this, and it's going to be what's called SIOPs, right? So sales, inventory, and operations planning. That's a very classic process that I often have seen some really good SIOPs processes that are run by finance because of how important the forecast is. And the most profitable companies are going to be the ones that have exactly the right amount of sales to match 100% capacity of operations. And what I mean by that is that, first of all, you're either 100% utilizing your assets or you're going to be fully utilizing your labor. And if your demand is higher, right? So let's say you could hit 120% of your capacity. Well, that's good. But if you have a really good forecast and you have a really good SIOPs process, it's going to let you know early enough that you can actually increase price in order to reduce your win rate to the point where you're still at 100%. So for that, let's say it's for that last 10, 15, 20% of the volume that you do, you get an extra 5% on that entire volume. That's it. That's all straight to the bottom line, right? So it's amazing how much additional profit opportunity you have if we do a really good job, if FP&A can do a really good job of forecasting and being able to align operations and sales so that demand and fulfillment are as close together as possible. I've seen that be somewhere between 10 and 30% increase in net profit margin when done well for real companies that exist today that we've done work with. Who wouldn't love to have an extra 20%? Let's say for every $1 million in profit, I'll give you an extra 200,000. I mean, that's wild, but it's incredibly effective when it works out. And FP&A plays a critical role in being able to pull all those pieces together.
So you're saying the reason the airline oversells things is so they can get as close to 100% as possible.
Airlines have been doing surge pricing and capacity-based pricing since the 80s. And I saw a study that said it's somewhere between 30 and 50, something like 40% of their overall profit is because of that activity. Because of that last 3 to 4% of their revenue is a massive part of their overall profit.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't surprise me, right?
Yeah.
The airline industry is probably one of those examples we can all go to that has made pricing a key part of a strategy. First class, business class, the way they've stratified pricing. Everything they've done is to try to maximize that curve, right? If this person will pay $100, I want to get $100 from them. If this person will pay $500, I want to get $500, right? They try not to leave anything on the table. That's why they charge for bags now. If you want to use the bathroom, I think some of them charge, right? No, not quite yet, but you wonder sometimes. It's really interesting. And I can see you're about to say something. Karan's like, this subject's getting going.
Ryanair almost got there for charging for using the washroom. But also remember, Ryanair is also one of the most profitable airlines in the world. They made a strategy out of low-cost airlines. They pioneered it, and then they did it, and they did it well. So overall, strategy mattered, but the whole point of being the lowest in the market and then getting share to a point where they're one of the top 3 most profitable airlines, probably globally, you gotta give them credit. And I think I want to point to what Nate said earlier about the PSYOPs, and I think it's such an important and underrated concept in a way, especially for people who are selling physical goods. For people who are selling physical goods, knowing how much to produce, how much the sales is going to be, and not having access can be the difference between profitability and no profits almost, or even bankruptcy. You've seen companies that went bankrupt because they couldn't control the amount of return they ever got from their products because they couldn't forecast it properly or had so much access. And why companies like HomeSense and TJ and Marshall are thriving right now, because people are there's so much overabundance of goods in other channels that it's getting down to into their channel. So I think it's quite amazing how much PSYOP effectively works. So either that's finance, either that's supply chain working with finance, or either it's a mixture of both plus sales in it. But I think definitely sales need to be it, because you need to have a very clear forecast, not from the rosy glasses sometimes the sales wear sometimes, because sales is bound to be optimistic. They're paid to be optimistic, right? But that's where that optimism sometimes could be quite damaging sometimes when it's not rooted in analytics and knowing what the demand is. And I think that's where Nate's work really shines, and how can you better get to that equilibrium. So
FP&A guy here. One thing I hear again and again as I interview and talk with FP&A professionals is that learning business partnering is key to being a good FP&A professional. That's why I'm excited to share my new course material developed by Ron Montero and myself to teach us about business partnering. We talk about building relationships, managing tough conversations, and holding the business accountable. This material is the same material that's used in the new Harvard Online FP&A certificate. Go ahead, go to the FP&A guy, click on my digital FP&A business partnering course, and use the code podcast to save 20%. Your career will thank you. We got a couple great questions coming in from the audience. I'm going to throw those up on the screen here. But when you said sales and optimistic, it reminded me, many of you will know who Steve Young was. If you're in the U.S. and grew up watching football like I did, you'll recognize that name, one of the best quarterbacks ever. And he was comparing sales and the whole business to football. And he referred to salespeople as your wide receivers. Like you need them, but they're your divas. They're high maintenance. You got to take care of them. It's like finance is your offensive line. They don't get any appreciation. They just kind of take care of the quarterback. So it's kind of funny when you were mentioning sales, it reminded me of that. And yes, they definitely can be optimistic sometimes. We have to be there to validate and ensure that it's realistic. First question I want to throw up, and we'll send this one to you, Karan. So from a high-level perspective, how does products versus services differ in pricing strategy?
that's a great question. And I think that's where services, there's so much optimization that can happen in service pricing. Not that it can happen in product, but service. When people talk about value-based pricing really thrives in services, because that's where you can really talk about how are you creating value, how are you increasing revenue for your customer, how are you reducing cost for your customer, how are you reducing risk for your customer or time spent on something. So that's where when people misunderstand value-based pricing. Value-based pricing is not really a product in the CPG. I mean, it has applicability there, but it really shines in service-based and software-based models, because that's where you can really quantify. Versus product it can be all over the place. Product can have some version of value-based pricing when you're talking about high-tech gadgets, and high-tech gadgets can have some notion of value pricing. But product can also be selling cookies at Costco, and Costco wants to be at $10.99 day in, day out for the entire year and sell 5,000 cases a week, or you're out. So your product pricing there is very, I wouldn't say it's cost, but it's also cost plus some little with a flavor of competitiveness in there. So I think product strategies and service strategies very, very vary. So product, you can have a notion of competitive environment in there. It will happen. You may not want to price based on competition, but you do want to take that into account, and you want to make sure that you are adding more value to your product compared to the competition. So when you say competition based pricing, doesn't mean match your competitor. It's basically says, hey, add more value to your product so that you can be above and beyond that competitor's price. So how much premium and how much of a negative you want to be compared to your competitors. And then there's flavors of some cost-based pricing. I mean, as Nate pointed out, cost-based pricing has a role somewhere in almost every company. Cost-based pricing has a role because it sort of sets the benchmark of what is the lowest you have to be for you to be maintaining your profitability and to be a viable, thriving business. Because if you don't have that, or you don't know what your costs are, you're going to be in deep trouble. And a lot of companies don't allocate the cost properly. They don't know what their cost structure is, because something is a fixed cost that's not allocated properly. So it just sits in a bucket somewhere else. It shows up 6 months later when an auditor calls up and says, hey, what's this cost? And then you start allocating. It's cost-based pricing has a role, competition has a role, so And then value-based pricing has a role in product, but services really thrives on value. So if you're in service, you really need to ask yourself a question: what is the value I'm providing, and how am I quantifying that value?
Really, really good point. I need to do that exercise for my business. And I can tell Nate's dying to say something because
Yes.
he raised his hand on a podcast.
Anyways, okay. I'm trying to be polite. I want to say one other thing. I think Karan did a really good job of talking about the pricing side of it, but I do think if I go back to the PsyOps, what's the difference between product and service? Okay. So how do you define your ideal capacity, right? What's the ideal capacity that I want to sell? For airlines, it's easy. There's 192 seats on an Airbus A321 and it leaves on May 23rd at 7 a.m. right? So that's very easy to say, here's our capacity. With labor in services, right? So you have to get to, okay, how many hours, let's say I'm going to pick an HVAC repair company as an example. Their labor utilization rate is, for 40 hours a week, I can sell 35 hours worth of valuable time. And then I get parts plus labor costs. And I get, so it's like, it ends up being, you're going to forecast your total capacity very differently for service-based business when you go into a PsyOp meeting than if you have a product-based business. One of the reasons I do talk about this is it's surprising how often people will say they can't forecast their overall capacity in a service business. And I think that's incorrect. It's actually quite easy to forecast your capacity. If you can forecast your capacity, that will really help you understand whether or not you can go up or down in pricing. Do you have an opportunity to increase price because you're overselling? Do you have an opportunity, maybe if I lower price a little bit, do I have an opportunity to utilize additional capacity?
Thank you. Appreciate that. So I need to do that so I can determine if I should be raising my prices. Got it. I'll come to you for that. All right. We have another question from Dave, and I'm going to send this one to you first, Nate. So he asks, I think you've had some experience with activity-based costing. So he's asking, do you have experience, thoughts on effectiveness of ABC models' influence on pricing?
This one, thinking about it for a little bit, because it's a really good question. I think activity-based costing is a very good process to follow in terms of giving you an idea of what it could end up costing. Now, what I would probably do, the issue I have with activity-based costing is it doesn't do a good job of splitting out fixed cost versus variable. And the fact that And so I would really want to get into, if you're going to go really deep on a topic, I think activity-based cost is, and meeting that margin is probably your baseline. But I think we actually need to dive into an analysis of, okay, well, here's my true fixed cost and here's my true variable cost in order to identify whether or not we have opportunity to go lower or go higher. Because I think, like I said, I think activity-based costing is a good place to start. But if I'm going to build a forecast sheet and I'm going to look at all of that stuff, I am going to absolutely understand the difference between those two, because if you have a very high fixed, right? So it's very expensive to be a cost leader is what I'm going to say, right? So you have to have a lot of capital investment in order to have low unit costs. Well, if all you're doing is activity-based costing and you have to cover your allocations, you're actually going to miss out on the opportunity that you have, that your variable costs are very low. And so you have more opportunity to go in at a lower price.
Got it. That makes sense. Really, what I'm hearing there is if you're doing ABC, you need to make sure you understand that fixed bucket, how it impacts things, how you think about that, so that you're making intelligent decisions, so to speak. All right. Great. Any thoughts you want to add? Anything you wanted to add to that one, Karan, before I go on to the next question?
Nate added pretty good perspective. The only thing I would say is that activity-based costing and pricing based off that can only work, and it should only work in a very small subset of industries. And I'm really looking at manufacturing there, and manufacturing generic products, not even manufacturing complicated stuff, because then you can really go into value-based pricing. But if you're just basically, manufacturing widgets out of a factory, that's very competitive. Maybe that's where you can really, but if you're manufacturing robots, and that's where you can really shine with more value-based pricing and, or any other complicated piece of equipment, because there's several ways to add value in the manufacturing process, from service to warranty to, quality of the product, or, usage, etc. There's just a lot there. So I hope that's for a very sliver of companies that are really using activity-based costing and then making pricing decisions off it, because it's dangerous.
Question from the audience I want to cover, and then we'll get back to a couple questions I have, and we'll wrap up. Samir asked, how can we effectively balance competitive pricing with maintaining profit margins, especially in highly saturated markets where there's a lot of competition, or as we often think of economics, perfect competition, even though there's really no such thing. But what's your thoughts there on that question? We'll start with you, Karan. What's your take?
If you really look at CPG, for example, and you look at companies like Unilever, P&G, Kimberly-Clark, highly competitive. They're selling, things that are highly replaceable with other brands, highly replaceable with store brands. But look at their results coming out of the pandemic and even right now. And I think what really matters, people focus too much about the price, where they really should be focusing, even the pricing folks should be focusing, is working with the product to figure out where can they create value. And I think the way to differentiate yourself in highly competitive and saturated markets is to differentiate yourself based on value. And you could be any product. It doesn't matter if physical product or a service product or a wholesale product, distribution company. You could be any of these as long as you're focusing on value. I think when you focus on value, you take price out of the discussion. At least not to it's not a driving factor to an extent it is without the value add in there. So I think that's where you got to find the healthy balance. I don't necessarily condone decreasing pricing because it's a competitive marketplace. I would say it's more of if you are coming out of the pandemic, you had a high price. This is the time to add value to your price and not discount it. Yeah, and the other thing is I would say use one thing that gets overlooked is using promotions and discounts constructively. That's a great way of maintaining profit margins, increasing volume without actually making any substantial improvement or changes to your pricing strategy. Sometimes just optimizing your discount by 1% is same as increasing your revenue by 1% or prices by 1%. So go there as well. So that's probably the other place to look for margin.
I think great recommendations there is looking at value. How can you add value to the product? That was a conversation we regularly had, because at the end of the day, if you sell on value and you're not selling on price, you have so much more opportunity. We had a huge problem with the companies I worked with. My head of sales, or she's basically was the CRO. She would always be like, if I see heavy discounting, I know they're not selling on value. And there's a training issue there. If they're regularly discounting a one-off deal, we get salespeople will do it. But we had a situation where the sales team just constantly doing that, and we ended up letting go of that sales team and starting over in a different location with the methodology of, look, it needs to be about value, because we were just giving away way too many margins. And it was fun as the finance guy to be like, no, I can't approve that deal. No, I can't approve that deal. I think they came to hate me, but that's another story. But it was the right thing to do. You got to make those decisions. So we don't have a lot of time left. So what I want to do is I want to ask a question here for both Nate and Karan, and then we'll go to one or two more questions, and then we're going to have a little fun section as we only have about 10 minutes left. First question, is there a favorite kind of framework you like to use that helps you analyze pricing? When you go into a pricing situation where you need to understand the company's pricing, is there a framework or method you use to work through that and understand it better? And Nate, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think there's two answers to that, but I'm gonna step out of the FP&A role and I'm gonna go to the overall business strategy. One of the questions I always like to ask is, if I go to the CEO and I ask the CEO, okay, what makes you special in the market? What makes you different? I'll call it the strategic differentiation. The CEO might give me an answer and say, we're a value leader. And if I go to the CRO or to a salesperson and they don't give me the same answer, that company is losing money all the time, because it is really important is that there's agreement across the entire organization of, are we a price leader? Are we a value leader? Are we a product leader? Are we, service leader? What is our position in the market? And so whenever I'm, I could answer, honestly, my favorite is value-based pricing. That's the way I think about it. Like, to me, value-based pricing means that I'm actually adding the most value to my customer. And that's my job. I'm here to make my customer millions of dollars. And if I do that and I get a slice of it, awesome. But at the end of the day, I want them to be successful. So the value-based pricing is my favorite. But I think it's really important to make sure that the company is aligned on what is our strategy in the marketplace. Are we a value leader? Are we what is that? And it's not just that the CEO knows, it's that you get the same answer from everybody in the organization.
Thank you. And Karan, what's your thoughts on that?
I think very similar, like value-based pricing is probably the gold standard of how pricing needs to be done, but obviously it doesn't work everywhere. It works in most cases, but not all. So he already mentioned where value-based pricing works. You should know what value you're creating. And then you also can you quantify it? And also you have to really be able to quantify it, because otherwise it's just a statement. So a lot of people will say, our company is strategic. Yeah, every company is strategic. Can you quantify how strategic, what you mean by strategic? Or they say, we provide great customer service. Okay, great. How do you quantify it? Do you have reduced response time? Do you have 24/7 support? Things like that. Those are the kind of things that go into value-based pricing. And my advice is, when you are starting off pricing something new, then you need to work from the grounds up, do your research, know who your competitors are, know what value you're creating, know what your clear goals and KPIs are. And, as long as you do all of those things, and when you price the product, then you can just optimize over time. People worry too much about their initial price, that, hey, we're going to launch a product, we're going to have it perfect. There is no perfect price. There was never a perfect price. If there was a perfect price, maybe Nate was been a millionaire or billionaire by now. But there's no perfect price. It's an optimization process. As long as you have a framework for what to change, when you figure out the value that you're delivering, you will, that's where you'd really have mastered value-based pricing or pricing in general.
The way we've managed data is perfect for a world that no longer exists. Over half your team's time is spent cleaning data. Imagine a notebook that does the work for you. Turn dirty data into a powerful asset with analyst intelligence. Join modern FP&A teams at analystintelligence.com today. I love something you said about, right? Every company says they're strategic. If you ask a company and they tell you they're not strategic, you probably want to run, right? But what I've said, I think this is something for finance professionals to remember, and I think you could see this in pricing as well. If a company is strategic, what I mean is they really have a competitive advantage, they're being strategic in what they're doing, you're going to see it in their bottom line. They should have above average returns if they're implementing a strategy that the market is perceiving value in, right? Because you could have a great strategy, but if the market doesn't perceive it valuable, it's the wrong strategy. And there's something to that to be said for pricing as well. Not to say that you're always getting more than your competitors. Low price can be the right price for your strategy. Medium price can be the right price. Something along the entire spectrum where you have something for low, for medium, for high. There's not a right strategy here. There's frameworks to use. Value pricing is the gold standard, as everybody said. And so you need to think about that. And so that's just something I'd say is, if you're doing pricing right, you're going to see it in the bottom line in one way or another. It could be in volume that comes through to the EBITDA, could be in your margins. Now, it's not always the same way, but you will see it. All right. So I want to ask one more question that came through, and then I have a couple fun questions for you guys. So someone asked it, I think it was Damien, and Karan, I'll throw this one to you. Any thoughts on rebate strategies? I know you probably saw that in the automotive industry a fair amount.
I've managed pricing and I've managed discounting throughout my career. I've probably at this point gone through $10 billion in discount over my lifetime. And they're all very different. Like, because the rebates could mean different things. So in the retail industry, you could be a high-low product. So for example, when you're in US, you go to stores like Walgreens, or in Canada, stores like Shoppers Drug Mart, they have a high-low pricing that, have a high price on day 1 and day 7 is low price. And the difference is a part of a rebate strategy. Or you could be more of a rebate where we are more giving people rebate based off hitting certain KPIs. So it's very common in B2B or service industry, or B2B industries or wholesaling, where you give a price upfront, which is very common. People want to protect their price in the market. They don't want everyone to have different price points. So for example, if I was selling something to Walmart and Target and, Whole Foods or whichever retail chain, I would want everyone to have the same sort of list price that, hey, here's the price everyone pays. But because everyone will have different requirements for margins, then you get into the world of rebates and how much rebate does everyone get. Someone gets $5 off for a unit, someone gets $2 off a unit, $3 off a unit. So there's constructive ways and it's a great way to structure your pricing when you want uniformity in pricing in the market. Because what happens in a lot of companies which don't look at this stuff is they'll launch a product across 8 different retailers at 8 different prices and then realize, oh, they're all buying off each other now at some point, or people are buying off cross-shopping across different retailers because they didn't control it. So rebates is a good way to control it. And also rebates can be used all the way between manufacturer and seller sometimes based on production targets, etc. So I think it's a very loaded question, I would say. But what I would really say is start measuring. People, the biggest issue I find with rebates is people don't measure. They just anniversary a promotion, anniversary a rebate year after year, because that's how every sales guy just did it or signed up for it, and or budget was made. But when you don't question it, a lot of bad promotions and bad rebates go through. And I think the same study that showed the 1 to 11% also showed, I think, the amount of off invoice rebates that are there. So if you're not, there's all sorts of rebates, on invoice rebates, off invoice rebates, volume rebates, kickbacks, etc., etc. So if you're not controlling that entire spectrum of rebates, you are losing out to someone who is. So I think and that's one way I've always optimized our pricing is before we optimize price, we optimize discounts. And it's always been very, very beneficial for us.
Great answer there. We only have about 4 minutes left, so I'm going to go into a kind of rapid fire, get to know you fun section. And I'm going to throw the questions. Who should I go with first? Any volunteers? We'll go to Karan here first. We're going to do 2, I'll call kind of work-related and 2 kind of fun. And the idea is you get about 15 to 20 seconds to answer these. So trying to be quick. First one, in your opinion, what's the number one technical skill pricing professionals need?
Modeling statistics and probability, I would say. Probability is probably a good one to learn because over time your models will get complicated, and it's something that you should probably learn, and game theory.
All right, so we'll throw that all in. Modeling statistics, game theory. We'll call it one thing. All right, what's the number one soft skill pricing people need?
The art of persuasion.
Don't we all?
Creating a team full of people from execs down to senior managers to whoever you're working on the other side who will have conflicting goals as you, and getting them on alignment that's what separates the people who are doing just pricing to people who are strategic about pricing and able to raise it to a standard where organization cares about it. So I would say that's a soft skill. And
Love it.
Highly recommend the book. Yeah, highly recommend the book by Robert Cialdini as well. So
I don't need to ask you the book you'd recommend, so we'll skip that one. Next one is, if you're going on a trip tomorrow and you can go anywhere in the world, where are you going? Paris. Nice. And then the last thing, if I told you you could have dinner with anyone in the world tonight that's alive, who are you taking to dinner?
That's a tough one. But I don't know, it'd be hard to beat Jeff Bezos. I think someone who's basically transformed the entire world and how we operate and buy is probably, you probably want to.
Jeff would be a great one.
You have to be a great one. I think it's very cliche, but probably interesting.
I like it. Nate, I'm going to mix them up a little bit on you. So you're going to get a different set of questions. First one is, if you could take anyone to dinner not alive, who are you taking?
Ooh. Oh, man, I had an answer. Well, my answer for somebody alive was obviously Paul Barnhurst.
Of course.
So
now, be serious.
Anyone not alive, I'm going to have to go back to, I would love to take some of the people that were involved in the setup of the Federal Reserve. I actually don't know who they are, but I would love to go back and understand some monetary policy theory. That's just me being a nerd. I love that stuff. So
Alexander Hamilton would be a good place to start.
Yeah, for sure.
Great one. I'll join you for that dinner.
Okay, sounds great.
All right.
Well, then all three. Then we get both of those. You, me, and Alex. Yeah, it's great.
There you go. You get a live and we covered them both.
Right.
All right, awesome.
Fantastic.
All right, we got about a minute left, so we're gonna go quick here. Next one is, what's your favorite Excel shortcut?
Control 1.
Control 1. All right. Yeah. Next question, what's the technical skill for FP&A professionals, not pricing?
Yeah. So, for FP&A, it's going to be forecasting. I mean, that's
forecasting. What's the number one soft skill for FP&A professionals?
I'm going to agree with Karan and say persuasion, influence and persuasion, 100%.
Great. Well, thank you guys for joining us. I really appreciate you spending an hour with us to talk about pricing. This will be released as a podcast. So if you enjoyed this, please share it with your friends and neighbors. Let them know. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Apologies, we didn't get to every question that was out there. We tried to cover as many as we could. But thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul. This was amazing. Thanks, Nate.
Thanks,
This
guys.
was really fun. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to FP&A Tomorrow. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a 5-star rating and a review on your podcast platform of choice. This allows us to continue to bring you great guests from around the globe. As a reminder, you can earn CPE credit by going to earmarkcpe.com, downloading the app, taking a short quiz, and getting your CPE certificate. To earn continuing education credits for the FPAC certification, take the quiz on Earmark and contact me, the show host, for further details.